Patients with rare diseases offer a compelling portrait of their condition, and understanding their experience, their lived experience, can play a big role in advancing therapies. Joining me now for a first-person account is Sarah Bacon. Sarah was diagnosed with Lamb disease in 2013. This is a rare lung disease that mostly affects women of childbearing age. Sarah's a patient advocate, and a writer. Sarah, I really appreciate you talking with us. And I have learned a lot about rare diseases in the last couple of years because we've done various programs there. And I don't think most of America realizes that 1 in 10 Americans have some form of rare disease. But each community of rare diseases, of which there are more than 7,000, can be a very small community. So can you tell us about your experience as a rare disease patient? Have you built community? What are the pieces of this scaffolding that we need to understand better?
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me. So social media has been a game changer for every single rare disease patient. Before, we used to really live in isolation. It was really hard to find your community. And that community is scattered across the world for LAM. LAM is short for lymphangioliomyomatosis, LAM for short. There are approximately 1,500 women in the US with LAM. That is a probability of being struck by lightning, as the same probability as being struck by lightning or killed by a tornado as being diagnosed by LAM, 1 in 2 million with LAM, excuse me. And across the world, there are approximately 250,000 of us. So imagine what it was like before we had social media to find our sisters in disease. For me, one of the first things I did in 2013 when I was formally diagnosed was to go online and see who was talking about this disease. And pretty soon, I found a patient advocacy group called the LAM Foundation and a second one called the LAM Health Alliance. Now, having 2 patient advocacy groups for my disease was also a stroke of luck, because so many rare diseases are so small that they don't have institutions advocating for them. But with LAM, there was a woman in the 1990s who founded the LAM Foundation in honor of her daughter who had been diagnosed with LAM. And they had already raised $19 million to fund research. I found a lot of comfort in the guidance they gave me and this other patient advocacy group, which is not a luxury that most rare disease patients have either.
Well, one of the things I've learned from talking to both men and women with rare diseases is how powerful they can be as agents, that they take hold of the situation. They interact with the FDA, they interact with the pharmaceutical companies, and play a role in building support for clinical trials and whatnot. I guess my question is, in your experience as you've looked at things, as one of the topics we're discussing today, are there structural enhancements one can make at something like the FDA with experts or rare disease advisory committees, or pieces of this therapy puzzle, if you will, that you have insights into that we could talk about?
Yes, well, there are some groups that exist. As part of the Affordable Care Act, President Obama instituted something called PCORI, which is the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, which was designed to bring in experts from the fields, practitioners, patients, consultants on advisory panels to help allocate funding for rare disease and larger medical research, so not just rare disease. I, for example, serve on the rare disease panel at PCORI, and we are a group of about 20 people. We're on 3-year terms, and we regularly look at a potential portfolio of grants And the goal of this patient-centered outcomes research institute was to really bring patients into the conversation, which had been led for so long by pharmaceutical companies, biotech, the FDA. And yet it's the patients who are the ones who are living day to day with progressive diseases, suffering, caretaking, and who know what these treatments, if we're lucky enough to have a treatment in the rare disease space, only 5% of rare diseases have treatments, let alone cures. But we're the ones who feel how those treatments affect our lives. So there's that. The NIH about 10 years ago started a program called NCATS, which was also dedicated to looking at ways in which research for one disease, say LAM, could translate to potential findings and research for other diseases. So, for example, my clinician, who also runs a lab at Columbia University, it's called the LAM Lab, determined that there are biomarkers for LAM and colon cancer and melanoma in LAM cells. So that finding could translate to potential treatments down the road for both colon cancer and melanoma through a LAM research lab. And this is an issue that is potentially of great proportions for broader patient populations that the NIH and others have been focusing on, this translational impact. What does it mean if you find a shared biomarker between LAM and other diseases with much larger patient populations?
It sounds to me like a remarkable development because it changes, I assume, I hate to put it down to this, but it changes the economics of it as well, right? It changes, the incentives to continue to go on, because there is a financial and investment dimension to this. And as I look at the challenge in rare diseases, the problem is that each vertical, if you will, of people who are suffering may be smaller than the NIH or corporate pharmaceuticals are interested in doing. I just be interested in your insights into what we might do to think about moderating. Is there a public policy need to step into these places where the economics aren't right?
Well, there has been legislation in the past. For example, in 1983, the Orphan Drug Act, which basically gave tax breaks for R&D to pharmaceutical companies to incentivize them to invest in disease groups with smaller patient populations, which of course aren't going to be as profitable for them down the line. That was huge step forward in promoting research for now over 7,300 rare diseases, which got very little funding. I mean, for many years, and still, the NIH is the world's largest funder of rare disease research. The world over. My doctor, who again runs a lab, has done all of her LAM research. I'd say 95% of her LAM research has been funded by consecutive NIH grants over the last 20 years or so. So there still is a real deficit of funding for that early stage research in the lab. And if there were further legislation to incentivize groups, whether biotech, big pharma, foundations, the federal government, whoever they may be, to invest in that early stage research, then we could find out so much more about that translational impact I was talking about, because it's getting the research off the ground. You have a proof of concept, and then you can apply for more NIH grants. But that's not going to do it all. When I was diagnosed, my very first evaluation with my doctor, she was asking me about my medical history. And I said, well, melanoma killed my father. and I have had melanoma. And she paused and she said, well, lamb cells and melanoma cells share biomarkers. And I said, well, what do you know about this? This was in 2013.
Mm.
And she said, nothing more than that. No one's researched it.
Mm.
And I said, so there are 80 dedicated lamb researchers around the world. That was in 2013. You guys know this and no one's funded research around it. How much would that cost? And I was thinking 6 figures, maybe 7 figures, having no prior background in biomedical research. She said, well, for 15 grand, I could design a study of women with lamb who have melanoma histories and get a proof of concept. And with that proof of concept, I could apply for more money to study it further and do a clinical trial. I thought 15 grand, that's a lot of money, but in the grand scheme of things for medical research, it was nothing. So I raised it and she designed the study and she had meaningful findings. It's that type of strategic funding and philanthropy, if you will, but strategic funding at the early stage level that can really lead to really meaningful discoveries.
It's a totally powerful example. I'm really grateful for you sharing that. Let me just ask you finally, Sarah. I imagine people are going to be watching this show today on World Rare Disease Day, but also looking at it down the road as someone in the future finds out they fit into one of these categories. I know this is sort of an unfair question, but for that person out there who's just all of a sudden hit with a realization that they're in a small community, that they may not have automatic on-ramps to therapies and cures, I'd be interested in what advice you'd give that individual.
Well, look, first of all, that shock of diagnosis with a progressive disease is like hitting hit by a bolt of lightning. So I would advise first and foremost, pause, take a deep breath, and turn online to find community. There is community out there for every rare disease, and know that you are your best advocate. I really became a hospitalist in a way, in that you're the one, you have to ask your doctors the tough questions. You have to get second and third opinions. You have to challenge the status quo, challenge the paradigms, because some diseases are so rare that the doctors who you inherently trust might not know where to look either. So you become a team. You've got to, if you can't do it yourself, because you're not feeling well enough, you've got to build a team of people who can help your family, dear friends, who can help you navigate for answers, because no one's going to do it for you.
Listen, folks, this is very valuable insights from someone who has lived experience in this space. I want to thank Sarah Bacon, who's a patient. She's a patient advocate and a writer. Thank you so much for sharing part of your journey and experience with us.
My pleasure, Steve. Thank you.